This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 7. A Fishy Episode. Rilla Blythe walked proudly, and perhaps a little primly, through the main street of the glen and up the manse hill, carefully carrying a small basketful of early strawberries which Susan had coaxed into lusciousness in one of the sunny nooks of Ingleside. Susan had charged Rilla to give the basket to nobody except Aunt Martha or Mr. Meredith, and Rilla, very proud of being entrusted with such an errand, was resolved to carry out her instructions to the letter. Susan had dressed her daintily in a white starched and embroidered dress, with a sash of blue and beaded slippers. Her long ruddy curls were sleek and round, and Susan had let her put on her best hat, out of compliment to the manse. It was a somewhat elaborate affair, wherein Susan's taste had had more to say than Anne's, and Rilla's small soul gloried in its splendors of silk and lace and flowers. She was very conscious of her hat, and I am afraid she strutted up the manse hill. The strut, or the hat, or both, got on the nerves of Mary Vance, who was swinging on the lawn gate. Mary's temper was somewhat ruffled just then, into the bargain. Aunt Martha had refused to let her peel the potatoes, and had ordered her out of the kitchen. "Yah, you'll bring the potatoes to the table with strips of skin hanging to them, and half boiled as usual. My, but it'll be nice to go to your funeral!" shrieked Mary. She went out of the kitchen, giving the door such a bang that even Aunt Martha heard it, and Mr. Meredith in his study felt the vibration, and thought absently that there must have been a slight earthquake shock. Then he went on with his sermon. Mary slipped from the gate and confronted the spick and span damsel of Ingleside. "What you got there?" she demanded, trying to take the basket. Rilla resisted. "Ith for Mithter Meredith," she lisped. "Give it to me." "I'll give it to him," said Mary. "No, Thuthan thaid I wathn't give it to anybody but Mithter Meredith or Aunt Martha," insisted Rilla. Mary eyed her sourly. "You think you're something, don't you, all dressed up like a doll? Look at me. My dress is all rags, and I don't care. I'd rather be ragged than a doll baby. Go home and tell them to put you in a glass case. Look at me! Look at me! Look at me!" Mary executed a wild dance around the dismayed and bewildered Rilla, flirting her ragged skirt, and vociferating, "Look at me! Look at me!" until poor Rilla was dizzy. But as the latter tried to edge away towards the gate, Mary pounced on her again. "You give me that basket," she ordered with a grimace. Mary was past mistress in the art of making faces. She could give her countenance a most grotesque and unearthly appearance, out of which her strange, brilliant white eyes gleamed with weird effect. "I won't," gasped Rilla, frightened but staunch. "You let me go, Mary Vanth." Mary let go for a minute and looked around her. Just inside the gate was a small flake, on which half a dozen large codfish were drying. One of Mr. Meredith's parishioners had presented him with them one day, perhaps in lieu of the subscription he was supposed to pay to the stipend, and never did. Mr. Meredith had thanked them and then forgotten all about the fish, which would have promptly spoiled had not the indefatigable Mary prepared them for drying and rigged up the flake herself on which to dry them. Mary had a diabolical inspiration. She flew to the flake, and seized the largest fish there, a huge flat thing, nearly as big as herself. With a whoop she swooped down on the terrified Rilla, brandishing her weird missile. Rilla's courage gave way. To be lambasted with a dried codfish was such an unheard-of thing that Rilla could not face it. With a shriek she dropped her basket and fled. The beautiful berries, which Susan had so tenderly selected for the minister, rolled in a rosy torrent over the dusty road, and were trodden on by the flying feet of pursuer and pursued. The basket and contents were no longer in Mary's mind. She thought only of the delight of giving Rilla Blythe the scare of her life. She would teach her to come giving herself airs because of her fine clothes. Rilla flew down the hill and along the street. Terror lent wings to her feet, and she just managed to keep ahead of Mary, who was somewhat hampered by her own laughter, but who had breath enough to give occasional blood-curdling whoops as she ran, flourishing her codfish in the air. Through the glen street they swept, while everybody ran to the windows and gates to see them. Mary felt she was making a tremendous sensation, and enjoyed it. Rilla, blind with terror and spent of breath, felt that she could run no longer. In another instant that terrible girl would be on her with the codfish. At this point the poor mite stumbled and fell into the mud puddle at the end of the street, just as Miss Cornelia came out of Carter Flagg's store. Miss Cornelia took the whole situation in at a glance. So did Mary. The latter stopped short in her mad career, and before Miss Cornelia could speak, she had whirled around and was running up as fast as she had run down. Miss Cornelia's lips tightened ominously, but she knew it was no use to think of chasing her, so she picked up poor, sobbing, dishevelled Rilla instead, and took her home. Rilla was heartbroken. Her dress and slippers and hat were ruined, and her 6-year-old pride had received terrible bruises. Susan, white with indignation, heard Miss Cornelia's story of Mary Vance's exploit. "Oh, the hussy! Oh, the little hussy!" she said, as she carried Rilla away for purification and comfort. "This thing has gone far enough, Anne dearie," said Miss Cornelia resolutely. "Something must be done. Who is this creature who is staying at the manse, and where does she come from?" "I understood she was a little girl from over harbour who was visiting at the manse," answered Anne, who saw the comical side of the codfish chase, and secretly thought Rilla was rather vain and needed a lesson or two. "I know all the over-harbour families who come to our church, and that imp doesn't belong to any of them," retorted Miss Cornelia. "She is almost in rags, and when she goes to church she wears Faith Meredith's old clothes. There's some mystery here, and I'm going to investigate it, since it seems nobody else will. I believe she was at the bottom of their goings-on in Warren Mead's spruce bush the other day. Did you hear of their frightening his mother into a fit?" "No. I knew Gilbert had been called to see her, but I did not hear what the trouble was." "Well, you know she has a weak heart. And one day last week, when she was all alone on the veranda, she heard the most awful shrieks of murder and help coming from the bush. Positively frightful sounds, Anne dearie. Her heart gave out at once. Warren heard them himself at the barn, and went straight to the bush to investigate, and there he found all the manse children sitting on a fallen tree and screaming murder at the top of their lungs. They told him they were only in fun, and didn't think anyone would hear them. They were just playing Indian ambush. Warren went back to the house and found his poor mother unconscious on the veranda." Susan, who had returned, sniffed contemptuously. "I think she was very far from being unconscious, Mrs. Marshall Elliott, and that you may tie to. I have been hearing of Amelia Warren's weak heart for 40 years. She had it when she was 20. She enjoys making a fuss and having the doctor, and any excuse will do." "I don't think Gilbert thought her attack very serious," said Anne. "Oh, that may very well be," said Miss Cornelia, "but the matter has made an awful lot of talk, and the Meads being Methodists makes it that much worse. What is going to become of those children? Sometimes I can't sleep at nights for thinking about them, Anne dearie. I really do question if they get enough to eat even, for their father is so lost in dreams that he doesn't often remember he has a stomach, and that lazy old woman doesn't bother cooking what she ought. They are just running wild, and now that school is closing, they'll be worse than ever." "They do have jolly times," said Anne, laughing over the recollections of some Rainbow Valley happenings that had come to her ears. "And they are all brave and frank, and loyal and truthful." "That's a true word, Anne dearie. And when you come to think of all the trouble in the church those two tattling, deceitful youngsters of the last ministers made, I'm inclined to overlook a good deal in the Merediths." "When all is said and done, Mrs. Dr. dear, they are very nice children," said Susan. "They've got plenty of original sin in them, and that I will admit, but maybe it is just as well, for if they had not they might spoil from over-sweetness. Only I do think it is not proper for them to play in a graveyard, and that I will maintain." "But they really play quite quietly there," excused Anne. "They don't run and yell as they do elsewhere. Such howls as drift up here from Rainbow Valley sometimes! Though I fancy my own small fry bear a valiant part in them. They had a sham battle there last night, and had to roar themselves, because they had no artillery to do it. So Jem says. Jem is passing through the stage where all boys hanker to be soldiers." "Well, thank goodness he'll never be a soldier," said Miss Cornelia. "I never approved of our boys going to that South African fracas. But it's over, and not likely anything of the kind will ever happen again. I think the world is getting more sensible. As for the Merediths, I've said many a time, and I say it again, if Mr. Meredith had a wife, all would be well." "He called twice at the Kirks last week, so I am told," said Susan. "Well," said Miss Cornelia thoughtfully, "as a rule, I don't approve of a minister marrying in his congregation. It generally spoils him. But in this case it would do no harm, for everyone likes Elizabeth Kirk, and nobody else is hankering for the job of stepmothering those youngsters. Even the Hill girls balk at that. They haven't been found laying traps for Mr. Meredith. Elizabeth would make him a good wife if he only thought so. But the trouble is, she really is homely, and Anne dearie, Mr. Meredith, abstracted as he is, has an eye for a good-looking woman, manlike. He isn't so otherworldly when it comes to that, believe me." "Elizabeth Kirk is a very nice person, but they do say that people have nearly frozen to death in her mother's spare-room bed before now, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan darkly. "If I felt I had any right to express an opinion concerning such a solemn matter as the minister's marriage, I would say that I think Elizabeth's cousin Sarah over harbour would make Mr. Meredith a better wife." "Why, Sarah Kirk is a Methodist!" said Miss Cornelia, much as if Susan had suggested a Hottentot as a manse bride. "She would likely turn Presbyterian if she married Mr. Meredith," retorted Susan. Miss Cornelia shook her head. Evidently with her it was once a Methodist, always a Methodist. "Sarah Kirk is entirely out of the question," she said positively, "and so is Emmeline Drew, though the Drews are all trying to make the match. They are literally throwing poor Emmeline at his head, and he hasn't the least idea of it." "Emmeline Drew has no gumption, I must allow," said Susan. "She is the kind of woman, Mrs. Dr. dear, who would put a hot water bottle in your bed on a dog night, and then have her feelings hurt because you were not grateful. And her mother was a very poor housekeeper. Did you ever hear the story of the dishcloth? She lost the dishcloth one day, but the next day she found it. Oh yes, Mrs. Dr. dear, she found it, in the goose at the dinner table, mixed up with the stuffing. Do you think a woman like that would do for a minister's mother-in-law? I do not. But no doubt I would be better employed in mending little Jem's trousers than in talking gossip about my neighbours. He tore them something scandalous last night in Rainbow Valley." "Where is Walter?" asked Anne. "He is up to no good, I fear, Mrs. Dr. dear. He is in the attic writing something in an exercise book, and he has not done as well in arithmetic this term as he should, so the teacher tells me. Too well I know the reason why. He has been writing silly rhymes when he should have been doing his sums. I am afraid that boy is going to be a poet, Mrs. Dr. dear. He is a poet now, Susan. Will you take it real calm, Mrs. Dr. dear? I suppose it is the best way, when a person has the strength. I had an uncle who began by being a poet and ended up by being a tramp. Our family were dreadfully ashamed of him." "You don't seem to think very highly of poets, Susan," said Anne, laughing. "Who does, Mrs. Dr. dear?" asked Susan, in genuine astonishment. "What about Milton and Shakespeare and the poets of the Bible?" "They tell me Milton could not get along with his wife, and Shakespeare was no more than respectable by times. As for the Bible, of course things were different in those sacred days, although I never had a high opinion of King David, say what you will. I never knew any good to come of writing poetry, and I hope and pray that blessed boy will outgrow the tendency. If he does not, we must see what emulsion of cod-liver oil will do." End of chapter 7. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 8. Miss Cornelia Intervenes. Miss Cornelia descended upon the manse the next day and cross-questioned Mary, who, being a young person of considerable discernment and astuteness, told her story simple and truthfully, with an entire absence of complaint or bravado. Miss Cornelia was more favourably impressed than she had expected to be, but deemed it her duty to be severe. "Do you think," she said sternly, "that you showed your gratitude to this family, who have been far too kind to you, by insulting and chasing one of their little friends, as you did yesterday?" "Say, it was rotten mean of me," admitted Mary. "I dunno what possessed me. That old codfish seemed to come in so blamed handy. But I was awful sorry. I cried last night after I went to bed about it. Honest I did. You can ask Una if I didn't. I wouldn't tell her what for, 'cause I was ashamed of it. And then she cried too, because she was afraid someone had hurt my feeling. Laws, I ain't got any feelings to hurt worth speaking of. What worries me is why Mrs. Wiley hain't been hunting for me. It ain't like her." Miss Cornelia herself thought it rather peculiar, but she merely admonished Mary sharply not to take any further liberties with the minister's codfish, and went to report progress at Ingleside. "If the child's story is true, the matter ought to be looked into," she said. "I know something about that Wiley woman, believe me. Marshall used to be well acquainted with her when he lived over harbour. I heard him say something last summer about her and a home child she had, likely this very Mary creature. He said someone told him she was working the child to death and not half feeding and clothing it. You know, Anne dearie, it has always been my habit neither to make nor meddle with those over harbour folk. But I shall send Marshall over tomorrow to find out the rights of this if he can, and then I'll speak to the minister. Mind you, Annie dearie, the Merediths found this girl literally starving in James Taylor's old hay barn. She had been there all night, cold and hungry and alone, and us sleeping warm in our beds after good suppers." "The poor thing," said Anne, picturing one of her own dear babies, cold and hungry and alone in such circumstances. If she had been ill-used, Miss Cornelia, she mustn't be taken back to such a place. I was an orphan once in a very similar situation." "We have to consult the Hopetown asylum folks," said Miss Cornelia. "Anyway, she can't be left at the manse. Dear knows what those poor children might learn from her. I understand that she has been known to swear. But just think of her being there 2 whole weeks, and Mr. Meredith never waking up to it! What business has a man like that to have a family? Why, Aunt Dearie, he ought to be a monk." 2 evenings later Miss Cornelia was back at Ingleside. "It's the most amazing thing," she said. "Mrs. Wiley was found dead in her bed the very morning after this Mary creature ran away. She has had a bad heart for years, and the doctor had warned her it might happen at any time. She had sent away her hired man, and there was nobody in the house. Some neighbours found her the next day. They missed the child, it seems, but supposed Mrs. Wiley had sent her to her cousin near Charlottetown, as she had said she was going to do. The cousin didn't come to the funeral, and so nobody ever knew that Mary wasn't with her. The people Marshall talked to told him some things about the way Mrs. Wiley used this Mary that made his blood boil, so he declares. You know, it puts Marshall in a regular fury to hear of a child being ill-used. They said she whipped her mercilessly for every little fault or mistake. Some folks talked of writing to the asylum authorities, but everybody's business is nobody's business, and it was never done." "I am sorry that Wiley person is dead," said Susan fiercely. "I should like to go over harbour and give her a piece of my mind. Starving and beating a child, Mrs. Dr. dear! As you know, I hold with a lawful spanking, but I go no further. And what is to become of this poor child now, Mrs. Marshall Elliott?" "I suppose she must be sent back to Hopetown," said Miss Cornelia. "I think everyone hereabouts who wants a home child has one. I'll see Mr. Meredith tomorrow and tell him my opinion of the whole affair." "And no doubt she will, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan, after Miss Cornelia had gone. "She would stick at nothing, not even at shingling the church spire, if she took it into her head. But I cannot understand how even Cornelia Bryant can talk to a minister as she does. You would think he was just any common person." When Miss Cornelia had gone, Nan Blythe uncurled herself from the hammock where she had been studying her lessons, and slipped away to Rainbow Valley. The others were already there. Jem and Jerry were playing quoits with old horseshoes borrowed from the Glen blacksmith. Carl was stalking ants on a sunny hillock. Walter, lying on his stomach among the fern, was reading aloud to Mary and Di and Faith and Una from a wonderful book of myths, wherein were fascinating accounts of Prester John and the Wandering Jew, divining rods and tailed men, of Shamir, the worm that split rocks and opened the way to golden treasure, of Fortunate Isles and Swan Maidens. It was a great shock to Walter to learn that William Tell and Gellert were myths also, and the story of Bishop Hatto was to keep him awake all that night. But best of all he loved the stories of the Pied Piper and the Sangreal. He read them thrillingly, while the bells on the Tree Lovers tinkled in the summer wind, and the coolness of the evening shadows crept across the valley. "Say, ain't them interesting lies?" said Mary admiringly when Walter had closed the book. "They aren't lies," said Di indignantly. "You don't mean they're true?" asked Mary incredulously. "No, not exactly. They're like those ghost stories of yours. They weren't true, but you didn't expect us to believe them, so they weren't lies." "That yarn about the divining rod is no lie anyhow," said Mary. "Old Jake Crawford over harbour can work it. They send for him from everywhere when they want to dig a well. And I believe I know the Wandering Jew." "Oh, Mary!" said Una, awestruck. "I do, true's you're alive. There was an old man at Mrs. Wiley's one day last fall. He looked old enough to be anything. She was asking him about cedar posts, if he thought they'd last well, and he said, 'Last well? They'll last 1,000 years. I know, for I've tried them twice.' Now if he was 2,000 years old, who was he but your Wandering Jew?" "I don't believe the Wandering Jew would associate with a person like Mrs. Wiley," said Faith decidedly. "I love the Pied Piper story," said Di, "and so does Mother. I always feel so sorry for the poor little lame boy who couldn't keep up with the others and got shot out of the mountain. He must have been so disappointed. I think all the rest of his life he'd be wondering what wonderful thing he had missed, and wishing he could have got in with the others." "But how glad his mother must have been," said Una softly. "I think she had been sorry all her life that he was lame. Perhaps she even used to cry about it. But she would never be sorry again, never. She would be glad he was lame, because that was why she hadn't lost him." "Some day," said Walter dreamily, looking afar into the sky, "the Pied Piper will come over the hill up there and down Rainbow Valley, piping merrily and sweetly, and I will follow him down to the shore, down to the sea, away from you all. I don't think I'll want to go. Jem will want to go. It will be such an adventure. But I won't. Only I'll have to. The music will call and call and call me until I must follow." "We'll all go," cried Di, catching fire at the flame of Walter's fancy, and half believing she could see the mocking retreating figure of the mystic piper in the far dim end of the valley. "No, you'll sit here and wait," said Walter, his great splendid eyes full of strange glamour. "You'll wait for us to come back. And we may not come, for we cannot come as long as the piper plays. He may pipe us round the world. And still you'll sit here and wait. And wait." "Oh, dry up," said Mary, shivering. "Don't look like that, Walter Blythe. You give me the creeps. Do you want to set me bawling? I could just see that horrid old piper going away on and you boys following him, and us girls sitting here waiting all alone. I don't know why it is. I never was one of the blubbering kind. But as soon as you start your spieling I always want to cry." Walter smiled in triumph. He liked to exercise this power of his over his companions, to play on their feelings, waken their fears, thrill their souls. It satisfied some dramatic instinct in him, but under his triumph was a queer little chill of some mysterious dread. The Pied Piper had seemed very real to him, as if the fluttering veil that hid the future had for a moment been blown aside in the starlit dusk of Rainbow Valley, and some dim glimpse of coming years granted to him. Carl, coming up to their group with a report of the doings in Antland, brought them all back to the realm of facts. "Ants are darn interesting," exclaimed Mary, glad to escape the shadowy piper's thrall. "Carl and me watched that bed in the graveyard all Saturday afternoon. I never thought there was so much in bugs. Say, but they're quarrelsome little cusses. Some of 'em like to start a fight 'thout any reason, far as we could see. And some of 'em are cowards. They got so scared they just doubled theirselves up into a ball and let the other fellows bang 'em. They wouldn't put up a fight at all. Some of 'em are lazy and won't work. We watched 'em shirking. And there was one ant died of grief 'cause another ant got killed. Wouldn't work, wouldn't eat, just died. It did, honest to goodness." A shocked silence prevailed. Everyone knew that Mary had not started out to say goodness. Faith and Di exchanged glances that would have done credit to Miss Cornelia herself. Walter and Carl looked uncomfortable, and Una's lip trembled. Mary squirmed uncomfortably. "That slipped out 'fore I thought. It did, honest to I mean, true's you live, and I swallowed half of it. You folks over here are mighty squeamish, seems to me. Wish you could have heard the Wileys when they had a fight." "Ladies don't say such things," said Faith, very primly for her. "It isn't right," whispered Una. "I ain't a lady," said Mary. "What chance have I ever had of being a lady? But I won't say that again if I can help it, I promise you." "Besides," said Una, "you can't expect God to answer your prayers if you take His name in vain, Mary." "I don't expect Him to answer 'em anyhow," said Mary of Little Faith. "I've been asking Him for a week to clear up this Wiley affair, and He hasn't done a thing. I'm going to give up." At this juncture Nan arrived breathless. "Oh, Mary, I've news for you. Mrs. Elliott has been over harbour, and what do you think she found out? Mrs. Wiley is dead. She was found dead in bed the morning after you ran away, so you'll never have to go back to her." "Dead!" said Mary, stupefied. Then she shivered. "Do you s'pose my praying had anything to do with that?" she cried imploringly to Una. "If it had, I'll never pray again as long as I live. Why, she may come back and haunt me." "No, no, Mary," said Una comfortingly. "It hadn't. Why, Mrs. Wiley died long before you ever began to pray about it at all." "That's so," said Mary, recovering from her panic. "But I tell you it gave me a start. I wouldn't like to think I'd prayed anybody to death. I never thought of such a thing as her dying when I was praying. She didn't seem much like the dying kind. Did Mrs. Elliott say anything about me?" "She said you would likely have to go back to the asylum." "I thought as much," said Mary drearily. "And then they'll give me out again. Likely to someone just like Mrs. Wiley. Well, I s'pose I can stand it. I'm tough." "I'm going to pray that you won't have to go back," whispered Una, as she and Mary walked home to the manse. "You can do as you like," said Mary decidedly, "but I vow I won't. I'm good and scared of this praying business. See what's come of it? If Mrs. Wiley had died after I started praying, it would have been my doings." "Oh, no, it wouldn't," said Una. "I wish I could explain things better. Father could, I know, if you'd talk to him, Mary. Catch me! I don't know what to make of your father, that's the long and short of it. He goes by me and never sees me in broad daylight. I ain't proud, but I ain't a doormat neither." "Oh, Mary, it's just father's way. Most of the time he never sees us either. He is thinking deeply, that is all. And I am going to pray that God will keep you in Four Winds, because I like you, Mary." "All right. Only don't let me hear of any more people dying on account of it," said Mary. "I'd like to stay in Four Winds fine. I like it, and I like the harbour and the lighthouse, and you and the Blythes. You're the only friends I ever had, and I'd hate to leave you." End of chapter 8.